23 minutes in, Adam Schiff looked like a man who thought history had finally reserved him a front-row seat. This was supposed to be his clean, televised climax. The polished interrogator, the national security hawk, the guy who did the homework, facing Donald Trump with the kind of questions that don't sound like questions at all. You could almost see Schiff's internal script scrolling. Russia, contacts, meetings, leverage, compromat. The whole library of insinuation that had lived on cable news for years. He'd rehearsed the opening line the way trial lawyers rehearse their first punch, not to learn it, but to make it land the same way every time. And what he didn't seem to anticipate, at least in this version of events, was that the evidence you can't see routine was about to meet the one thing it can't outrun: a screen big enough for everyone to read. In this telling, Trump didn't respond the way Trump usually does when he's cornered on camera. He didn't rant, or dodge into a grievance maze, or slap the table with a witch hunt and expect the room to move on. He smiled like someone who'd waited years for a specific moment and finally got the timing right. Then he picked up a remote and made a choice that, if you believe the narrative, turned the whole event from Q&A into ambush. A classified-style document appeared on the screens with a declassification stamp, the kind of thing viewers are trained to treat as sacred simply because it looks official. The headline text, as displayed in the story, was not subtle. It was a briefing title, a date, an acronym soup of seriousness, and one sentence that matters more than any monologue. No evidence of coordination or conspiracy found to date. The camera didn't need to interpret anything. It just lingered long enough for people at home to squint, read, and decide what they wanted it to mean. And Schiff's face, this is where the narrator wants you to stare, did that split-second transformation from confident prosecutor to man recognizing a trap by smell. If you've ever watched someone realize the floor is missing, you know the expression. The eyes shift, the jaw tightens, and the brain starts searching for an exit that isn't there. In the story's logic, the real damage wasn't the document itself, but the timestamp. March 15th, 2017, printed clean and bold, sitting there like a receipt. Because if Schiff was in that briefing, and the briefing said one thing, how did he spend years suggesting something stronger, darker, more certain? The narrative doesn't say crime out loud. It doesn't need to, because it's designed to let the audience supply the word. It's a classic move in political storytelling. Show a contradiction, and the crowd will do the sentencing for you. The narration then does what these stories always do. It rewinds just enough to make the present feel inevitable. 90 minutes earlier, Schiff is still the hunter in his own head, the guy who believes the country has been waiting for him to speak. 2 weeks earlier, the White House announces a transparency press conference, a phrase so vague it can mean sunlight or spotlight depending on who's holding it. The press secretary in this scenario gives Schiff special status. Front row, first question, the official antagonist invited on stage. And the media, predictably, treats it like a heavyweight fight, because fights are easier to package than facts. Schiff accepts with a straight face and a prosecutor's posture. He talks about truth, accountability, questions avoided, the kind of solemn language that signals to viewers that something righteous is about to happen. His staff, in the background, builds a question set like a trap deck. Assumptions embedded, follow-ups ready, escape routes cut off. Every line is engineered to force one of two outcomes. Either Trump admits something ugly, or Trump refuses, and refusal becomes guilt by implication. It's not even a partisan thing anymore. It's a media habit. The way modern politics borrows courtroom theater because courtroom theater sells. But the other side of the story, again, in this narrative, has been building its own binder. At FBI headquarters, Director Kash Patel is described as compiling a massive file. Every classified briefing Schiff attended, every public statement Schiff made afterward, every mismatch, every convenient certainty said aloud after private uncertainty was allegedly delivered in secure rooms. The file is depicted like a spreadsheet of credibility, a ledger of told X privately, said Y publicly, multiplied across years. And notice how careful the narrative tries to be while still steering you. It implies the file is verified, cross-referenced, properly declassified, without actually giving you a neutral third party to confirm any of it. That's the magic trick. Make the paperwork sound inevitable, then let the audience stop asking who stapled it together. When the day arrives, the East Room looks like a set built for confrontation. Every network is there. Every camera has its angle. And the two giant screens flanking the podium are basically a warning sign that this won't be normal. Schiff sits in a designated chair with a placard, which is a small detail that tells you the event was staged to spotlight him. Trump walks in calm, not rally crazy, not improvisational, but measured like someone reading from a plan. And he frames the whole thing as a cleanup operation. The public was told one story for years, and now he wants to show what was actually seen. Then comes the moment where Schiff asks what he thinks is his opening shot. He phrases it the way prosecutors phrase questions when they want the accusation baked into the grammar. Why so many contacts? Why so many lies? Why concealment? It's polished and aggressive without sounding angry, which is exactly what his team would have aimed for. He expects the familiar Trump response: denial, counterattack, diversion, because that response is easy to chase with follow-ups. Instead, Trump calls it a great question and uses it as a ramp into the screen reveal. This is where the narrative wants the audience to feel the click of a trap closing. A briefing document appears with bold lines and clinical language. Yes, contacts happened, but contacts alone don't equal conspiracy. To date, no evidence of coordination. Then Trump displays an attendance log, and Schiff's name is shown as present. His signature visible, the kind of visual that makes people feel like they're watching a confession without anyone confessing. The story doesn't require you to know anything about intelligence briefings, committee procedures, or how assessments change. It just requires you to recognize a signature. And once the signature is on the screen, the narrative asks a question designed to be unanswerable in the moment. Were you misleading then, or are you misleading now? That's not a legal question. It's a branding question. And branding questions are the ones that end careers. The story then escalates with a timeline, because timelines create the illusion of totality. It lists appearance after appearance, quote after quote, each one painted as stronger than the last, each one positioned next to briefings that supposedly stayed cautious. A counter ticks up, a supercut plays, and Schiff's words are looped until they sound like a chant. This is political narrative warfare at its cleanest. Repetition isn't there to inform, it's there to hypnotize. By the time the clip ends, the viewer isn't asking, "What's the nuance?" They're asking, "How could he say it that many times?" Schiff tries to respond with the oldest shield in the book: context, evolving assessments, complex intelligence picture. Those are real concepts, to be fair, because intelligence work is messy and rarely yields clean yes or no conclusions in real time. But the story undercuts him by immediately placing another briefing on the screen, another date, another line that reads like caution rather than certainty. Then it flashes Schiff's public statements afterward as if they were absolute, even if the actual phrasing in real life might have been more hedged, than the script implies. The tension here is not proof, it's contrast. And contrast is what the camera loves. Next, the narrative shifts to phone records and leak insinuations, which is where careful storytelling matters. Because a phone call to a reporter is not itself a leak, and correlation is not automatically causation, and timelines can be curated to imply intent that may not exist. But the story presents the pattern as suspicious. Calls followed by stories, again and again, as if the mere sequence is enough to convict in the court of public opinion. Trump, in the narrative, doesn't have to say felony to make the audience think it. He just says documentation and lets the viewer's imagination do the rest. And Schiff, caught on camera with the documents looming behind him, looks like a man trying to argue with the calendar. Then the script pivots to Ukraine and the impeachment era, because that's where emotional memory lives. It plays Schiff's dramatic paraphrase of Trump's call and contrasts it with the official transcript, side by side. The story insists Schiff made up quotes, then reminds you he later described it as parody, which is the kind of word that sounds flippant when placed next to an impeachment setting. A skeptical viewer might ask, what was the exact wording? What disclaimers were offered? What was rhetorical framing versus literal quotation? But the narrative doesn't pause long enough for those questions, because pausing is how you lose momentum, and momentum is the whole product. From there, it moves to the whistleblower question, another hinge point that's complicated in real life and simplified in political storytelling. The story displays meeting logs and call records to suggest prior contact, then plays a clip of Schiff denying direct contact, implying the denial was misleading. Again, a careful observer might ask, what does direct mean here? What was staff-to-staff communication? What was standard procedure? What was inappropriate? The narrative doesn't try to resolve those questions, it tries to keep them alive as suspicion. Suspicion is valuable because it keeps audiences engaged without requiring a verdict. Then comes the Hunter Biden laptop segment, which is where political narratives often go from heated to radioactive. In this story, a declassified-style briefing appears claiming the laptop was authentic and not a Russian operation, with a date and an attendance sheet that places Schiff in the room. Then it shows Schiff on television calling it disinformation, and the narrative frames that as a flat contradiction. But the reality around that episode, as most viewers remember, involved layers of uncertainty, competing assessments, and arguments about provenance, verification, and timing. The story deliberately compresses all that into a single binary because binaries are easier to narrate than nuance. The narrative adds the letter signed by former intelligence officials and suggests Schiff's orbit coordinated it, with emails on screen. It implies the letter's impact was to shape coverage and suppress attention, without leaning into any explicit claim about censorship or intent as fact. It asks the audience to connect dots. Briefing says one thing, public statements say another. Letter amplifies the public framing, and therefore the whole thing looks orchestrated. To stay in the realm of commentary rather than accusation, the smarter narrator keeps saying looks, appears, raises questions, invites skepticism. Because the moment you turn suggestion into certainty, you stop sounding like a commentator and start sounding like a prosecutor. Then Trump, in the story, turns the whole press conference into a single loaded question aimed at Schiff. How many times did you mislead the public? That's not a question designed to get an answer. It's designed to trap silence. Schiff can't easily litigate each document in real time on camera, and the narrative counts on that imbalance. The camera loves silence because silence reads as guilt, even when it's just shock or prudence. And the story treats Schiff's inability to deliver a clean rebuttal as the climax, the moment the room decides who won. After that, the rest of the press conference is depicted as irrelevant because the internet has already chosen its clip. The how many times moment becomes the viral shard that carries the whole narrative across platforms. A supercut of Schiff's statements, a close-up of his expression when the first document appears, and a split screen of impeachment paraphrase versus transcript, these are the images the story claims swallowed everything else. The media reaction in the narrative splits into predictable camps. Some call it selective release and political theater, others call it overdue exposure. But even sympathetic voices, the story suggests, struggle to explain the optics of signatures, dates, and direct language placed beside confident public claims. Then comes the political aftershock portion, where the story keeps things just ambiguous enough to avoid declaring guilt while still pushing consequences. Ethics complaints are filed. Reviews are announced. Leaders distance themselves with careful conditional language. A vote removes Schiff from a committee pending investigation, which is a move that can be framed as prudence without requiring a verdict. Polling collapses in the story like a stock chart in a panic, because modern politics is obsessed with numbers as moral judgment. And the narrative uses Democrats joining Republicans as proof that even his own side couldn't carry him, which is always the most devastating line in any scandal arc. Investigative outlets in the story pile on with timelines and compilations. Some reports are framed as neutral audits of statements versus briefings, which sounds sober even when it's fueled by a sensational hook. Other pieces are described as political obituaries, which is a dramatic genre disguised as analysis. The story claims more documents keep dropping in batches, each one feeding the sense that the fall is not only deserved, but mathematically inevitable. And Schiff's eventual attempt at a sympathetic interview becomes another trap, because friendly hosts still can't fix the visuals everyone saw on the screens. The narrative ends with formal censure, rare, heavy, symbolic, and then with Schiff stepping away from re-election, which reads like resignation without the word resign. It also gives the audience a neat moral. When someone tells you to trust them because the evidence is secret, demand proof when proof is possible. Trump, in the story's final framing, claims he didn't destroy anything. He released what was already written, and the released material did the damage by itself. That's a powerful posture because it turns political aggression into passive transparency, like the documents acted alone. And whether you buy that posture or not, the narrative wants you to remember a simple image: a declassified-looking page, a signature, and a man who suddenly can't speak. But if you're listening like someone who's watched politics long enough to distrust easy endings, you also hear the unanswered questions humming beneath the drama. Who selected which documents appeared first? And why those? And why in that order? What context didn't make it to the screen? And what would neutral reviewers say if they audited the full set without a camera pointed at anyone's face? How much of what the public read was assessment language that later changed, and how much was truly stable across time? And in a world where declassification can be a tool as much as a principle, who decides when transparency is sunlight and when it's a spotlight aimed like a weapon? And that's where the story stops being about Adam Schiff versus Donald Trump, and starts being about the country that keeps buying this kind of showdown like it's pay-per-view. Because the moment you put official-looking documents on giant screens, the audience isn't evaluating policy anymore. They're evaluating character. They're not asking who wrote the assessment, what caveats were attached, or what intelligence professionals mean when they say, "to date." They're asking the simpler, more brutal question: who looks like they got caught? And in modern politics, looks like is often treated as is, whether that's fair or not. The thing that makes this press conference feel like a thunderclap isn't the content alone. It's the reversal of the old power dynamic. For years, the advantage belonged to anyone who could say, "I've seen things you haven't," and then let the mystery do the work. Classified settings create asymmetry by design. The public can't check the source material, so they judge the messenger. That can be responsible. Sometimes it has to be, or it can be a convenient hiding place for overstatement, selective memory, and rhetorical inflation. This event, as the narrative frames it, flips the asymmetry. The messenger suddenly has to answer to the material. But even that flip has its own trapdoor. Because material on screen doesn't automatically mean full record, and anyone who's ever sat through Washington document wars knows the game is as much about what you don't show as what you do. The phrase declassified sounds like a clean moral category, like sunlight, like truth, like a judge's gavel. In reality, declassification is often a process with fingerprints all over it. Review decisions, redactions, selections, timing. So the more honest way to process this, even in a fictionalized telling, is to keep two thoughts in your head at once. The visuals can be powerful, and the visuals can be curated. That's why the questions in the room matter as much as the screens. Not the partisan gotchas, not the "sir, will you admit" nonsense, but the procedural questions that don't play well in highlight reels. Who requested the declassification? Who approved it? What standards were used? And what parts were withheld? If there were caveats in the briefings, uncertainty ranges, sourcing issues, alternative hypotheses, were those shown with equal emphasis? If assessments evolved, was that evolution displayed? Or was the narrative frozen at the most convenient timestamp? And here's the irony. Even asking those questions can make you look like you're defending someone. That's the disease of our political culture right now. Skepticism is treated as loyalty or betrayal, depending on which team benefits, instead of being treated as basic adult hygiene. If you say, "We should see the full record," someone hears, "You're covering for him." If you say, "These documents are damning," someone hears, "You're doing propaganda for Trump." So most people stop doing skepticism in public and start doing it in private. They watch the clip, they feel the emotional hit, and then they decide which side's interpretation they want to live with. That's why the viral moment is always a face, not a footnote. Schiff's expression becomes the story because it's easier than debating the meaning of coordination versus conspiracy. A signature on an attendance log becomes the story because it's easier than unpacking how lawmakers talk about intelligence without disclosing sources. If you want to understand why this fictional press conference blows up the way it does, you have to understand what it offers the audience: closure. It offers an end to 8 years of vague accusation versus denial ping-pong. It offers the fantasy that everything messy can be resolved by one clean reveal, one receipt, one timeline. And that fantasy is addictive because the real world rarely gives it to you. Real investigations end in reports that nobody reads and outcomes that disappoint everyone. This event, on the other hand, is packaged like a courtroom scene where the witness can't answer. The remote control is the gavel. The screen is the evidence table. The audience is the jury that doesn't have to deliberate. And the press, even when it tries to be careful, becomes the narrator of the drama rather than the auditor of the record. That's why the aftermath moves so fast in the narrative. Not because the Senate suddenly became morally outraged in a pure way, but because politics runs on risk management. If you're a Democratic senator watching your colleague get pinned to a screen with official seals and date stamps, your first instinct isn't "what's true?" It's "how toxic is this to stand near?" Washington doesn't punish sin. It punishes inconvenience. And nothing is more inconvenient than a scandal that comes with visuals that can be replayed without commentary. The removal from committee vote in the story works for the same reason. It's a distancing ritual. It's the institutional version of stepping away from someone at a party when the cops show up. You don't have to say he's guilty. You just have to say you want an investigation. Pending review is the safest phrase in politics because it signals seriousness without taking responsibility for the outcome. And if the outcome goes the other way, you can say you respected process. The media, in the narrative, tries a few frames, but none of them fully land because the audience already has its own. Selective release sounds plausible, but it's abstract. Out of context sounds plausible, but it requires attention span. Motive is political sounds obvious, but motives have always been political. The audience is numb to that. What the audience isn't numb to is the visceral feeling of watching someone lose control of a room. That's why the Schiff interview on MSNBC, as described, goes badly even with a friendly host. Because the host can't unshow what was shown. The host can't make a timeline look less like a timeline. The host can't turn a signature into an opinion. And Schiff, in this narrative, tries to do what politicians always do when cornered: climb into complexity and hope the audience gets tired. But audiences don't get tired when the clip has a counter-ticking 227 of 227. They don't get tired when there's a split screen that looks like a before and after. They don't get tired when the story offers a villain and a reveal. They get tired when you ask them to think. And thinking is exactly what Schiff needs them to do if he's going to survive. Now, a fair-minded listener might pause and say, hold on, intelligence briefings aren't simple. A briefing can say, no evidence to date, and still include concerning contacts that later become relevant. A lawmaker can describe circumstantial evidence in a colloquial sense, while investigators mean something narrower. Public commentary is often broader than the precise legal standards used in assessments. All true, and it's why real accountability should never be decided by a single clip. But the press conference, in this story, isn't designed for fairness. It's designed for narrative dominance. It's designed to make the public feel like they were lied to, and then to offer a villain who can absorb that anger. That's politically brilliant and civically corrosive at the same time. Because once you teach the public that politics is who lied, you also teach them that every side is hunting for a lie to pin on the other. And then every institution becomes a tool, not a referee. Declassification becomes a weapon, not a principle. Oversight becomes a stage, not a duty. Leaks become heroic or treasonous, depending on which team benefits. And public trust, already fragile, turns into a chip both sides cash in when convenient. The story's Schiff rules, reforms at the end, capture something real, even if the details are fictionalized. Institutions tend to write policy after embarrassment. They don't prevent the fire, they change the building code after the fire. So if you were writing this as a voiceover, the sharper commentary isn't Schiff is bad or Trump is good. The sharper commentary is, why did it take a spectacle for anyone to ask what was actually said in those briefings? Why did journalists repeat claims about evidence I can't show you without pressing for at least definitional clarity? Why did audiences accept certainty as a substitute for transparency? Why did the country treat "trust me" as an evidentiary standard? And why do so many people feel, deep down, that the only way truth can win is through humiliation? Those questions aren't partisan, they're structural. They're about incentives, and incentives are the real constitution of modern politics. In the narrative, Trump ends up looking vindicated because he can point to receipts. But even that victory has a catch. Once you normalize this kind of public declassification spectacle, you normalize the idea that truth is whatever gets displayed first. And what happens when a future president of either party decides to do the same thing but with a different target, a different selection, and a different motive? What happens when the screen shows a document that's technically real, but framed in a way that implies more than it proves? What happens when the audience has been trained to treat document on screen as the end of the debate? That's the long-term danger under the entertainment. A society that learns to trust the reveal becomes easy to steer. Not because people are dumb, but because people are busy, tired, and emotionally overloaded. They want clarity, and clarity is rare. So they'll accept packaged clarity even when it's incomplete, because incomplete clarity feels better than honest uncertainty. And that's what makes the Schiff arc so useful as a cautionary tale, even if you treat it as dramatized commentary. It shows how a public figure can be built out of tone and confidence when underlying material remains hidden. It shows how easily media systems reward the person who sounds certain, especially when the public can't verify the basis for certainty. It shows how quickly that certainty can backfire once verification becomes possible. And it shows how the same media machine that elevates someone can turn into a meat grinder when the narrative flips. There's also a grim humor to it, the kind only American politics can produce. For years, the country is told to believe the experts, and then the experts' power collapses because the audience believes a PowerPoint instead. For years, everyone complains about misinformation, and then the most viral content in the country is a compilation clip designed to make one man look trapped. For years, everyone says they want transparency, and then, when transparency arrives, it's delivered like a reality show elimination. This is where you can add a little satire without punching down. We've turned national governance into a genre, and the genre demands a villain every season.